Okay, so we're moving into the chapter on genetics. Now, a lot of the very basics of how inheritance works in terms of dominant recessive and a few other things are covered in the genetics lab. So there's a lot of crossover between what we're going to do here and it just went onto my face from the screen. What we're going to do here and what's in the lab. So expect when you start to get questions on the next exam, there's going to be questions that come off of that lab as well. That's typically the way we cover it. So the caption here says, there's another hereditary disease that runs in the royal family. Your grandfather was a stubborn fool, your father was a stubborn fool, and you are a stubborn fool. Now, it does turn out that personality is remarkably genetic, that the personality, large aspects of the personality you wind up with were there in your genetic combinations when you were born. And in fact, the one piece of supporting evidence I can show you is that if you look at a bunch of children in the same family who were raised essentially in the same environment, different ages, so not necessarily completely, but wide swath of different personalities. And often you can see bits and pieces of the parents' personalities played out in the children. So. Let's see. Chromosomes. Chromosomes are long pieces of DNA and protein. We've talked a little bit about that. And on these long stretches of DNA, there are genes. Now, this is a very old handout because if you look at a modern handout, it would take one of these and there would be thousands and thousands of named genes on the chromosome. Here, they've just picked some select genes. These are human chromosomes. Number 1, down through number 22, and the X and the Y. We have 24 types of chromosomes, but we all carry 23 pairs of chromosomes. And on the chromosomes are a whole bunch of genes stuck together that are not doing the same stuff, with the exception of the Y chromosome. The Y chromosome is the only chromosome where the genes are all performing similar functions. Those genes' jobs are to take an embryo that would physically become female and make it become physically and functionally male. And it doesn't take that many genes. That's why it's a little bitty chromosome with not a lot of genes on it. And people go, oh, it's got testosterone on it. No, it doesn't. Is that everybody needs to make testosterone because testosterone is critical for building and repairing muscles. So if you're human, you need to be able to make testosterone. It's just that, for you non-Y chromosome holders, you're making it in your adrenal glands rather than in, the male glands in men. But this idea that there are multiple genes on any given chromosome is called linkage. And why is it there? Why are the chromosomes there? There's debate over just how many genes people have. Somewhere between 12 and 15,000 different codes for proteins that we use to do all sorts of different things. But that's a lot, right? 12 to 15,000. You've got a pair of each one because you got one from mom and one from dad for everything but the X chromosome. So say you got 10,000 times 2, 20,000 DNA strands that are codes for proteins. That's a lot. And we're making cells all the time. We grew from a single cell that had to divide and divide and divide and divide, and every time it divided, it needed to make a copy of all the DNA, and then it needed to set up and move this copy this way and this copy that way. If every gene was a separate piece, so you had 20,000 genes that you then had to copy and make 40,000 genes, and then you had to get 20,000 copies to go this way and 20,000 copies to go that way. It's not gonna work very often, is it? What chromosomes do is it reduces the number of pieces of DNA that need to be copied and moved when cells make more cells to a number that you can actually do it and not screw up. So this is chapter 7. Now, we'll talk about dominant and recessive in the lab. Basically, just as a quick idea. You may have a code for a gene, but you may carry 2 slightly different codes, or sometimes 2 pretty different codes for the same protein. And it doesn't always make a protein that works exactly the same way. Is we have genes for proteins that produce color in our eyes, and different variations of that produce the different colors, except for the blue, which is always there as an underlayer. But the greens and the browns and all the other stuff are made from genes at the same location, producing slightly different colored proteins, different alleles. So you'd have an allele for light brown, or an allele for dark brown, or an allele for green, or an allele for hazel. But they would all be at a particular location on a chromosome, and you'd have 2 of them. Now, the idea of dominant and recessive, we sometimes have codes that make a protein that doesn't work, or it works very, very weakly. And we need, if it's something that we need, then we better have a copy that produces a working version. But if you have a working version and a non-working version, in most cases you have a working version and it does what it needs to do. And so you don't even know the non-working version is there. And that's where the idea of dominant and recessive, it's basically expressed and hidden. Nobody knew that about genes and alleles when the idea of dominant and recessive came up. Just that one thing could completely cover up the presence of the other one. And sometimes it's not a complete cover-up. Sometimes it's a partial cover-up because you have strong and weak expression, because this one makes a protein that works very, very well, and this one makes a variant of the protein doesn't really work all that great. So there's all sorts of variations here because you're making codes for these big complicated molecules, and the big complicated molecules work because of all of their shapes. And sometimes the shape just is wrong, and sometimes the shape just isn't quite right. So that's where the alleles and dominance and stuff comes from. Keep in mind there's an awful lot on the chromosome that is not actually codes. We talked about that. Is that a lot of non-coding stuff on your DNA. We have 46 chromosomes. That's the chromosome number for humans. The chromosome number for chimpanzees is 48. Is the chromosome number for Ascaris parasitic worms is 4. Is that there's a link in the book that shows you a bunch of different chromosome numbers for different things. It's a characteristic of a species. And usually in eukaryotic species, it's an even number because we tend to carry pairs of everything. So, 46, 48 for the chromosome number. And the chromosomes numbers can be low, like 4. They can be high, like 48. In plants, they can get really high. I'll explain why not in animals in a minute. But there is, happens a lot. High numbers, there's a good thing about it, there's a bad thing about it. Low numbers, there's a good thing about it that reflects the bad thing on the other side, and there's a bad thing about it that reflects the good thing on the other side. So we have 23 pairs of chromosomes. We sort through them, pick one of each pair to put into a sperm or an egg cell and send on to our offspring. That produces a whole bunch of different ways to mix alleles. The more separate pieces of DNA you have, the more you can take this one from this pair, and this one from this pair, and this one from this pair, and this one from this pair, this one from the other pair. And the sperm and the egg cells are all going to have, not all, but they're largely going to have different mixes of chromosomes. And then they're going to combine with different mixes from the other parent. And so there's going to be lots of different genetic mixes you get in your offspring. Remember, sexual reproduction produces more variation. The more chromosomes, the more ways you can sort that mix. The downside is 46 chromosomes is a lot to move around. When a cell makes another cell, you make copies. So now you got 92 chromosomes. Fortunately, we'll talk about this late in the chapter, they stay attached, the copies stay attached to one another until they're popped apart and moved apart. But even then, that's a lot of chromosomes to keep track of. And the more chromosomes you have, the more likely it is that they're not going where they're supposed to go, and the division doesn't work quite right. There's a couple of examples in people. In women, as women get older, the egg cells that you produce through your lifetime were actually formed around the time you were born. So however old you are, that's how old those cells are. And the older they get, the more they screw up divisions, making egg cells. So the more likely it is for an egg cell to get an extra chromosome. Instead of whoop, it's like whoop, is that two of them went one way instead of one copy and one copy going the other way. Now, low numbers is the flip side of this. You don't mess up divisions anywhere near as much if you've got a low number to move around. Make sure you can see that. But there's a limited number of ways that you can mix in an offspring. You only got 4 chromosomes. That means you got 2 pairs. And how many different ways can you pass, one of each pair on? Is not going to have a tremendous amount of variation in the offspring. If you understand math, that actually means that if you're reproducing by yourself, which some roundworms with low numbers can do, you actually can produce genetic copies of yourself. Because with only 4 chromosomes, it's not that hard to get the same mix you had if you're making your own sperm and your own egg cells. You don't need to know that. But if you think about it, it makes perfect sense. And remember, that gives you the advantage of asexual reproduction. Just to remind you, prokaryotes, bacteria, chromosome number of 1, right? They have a single loop-shaped chromosome. So, it doesn't really apply here. Oh, I was going to give you another example. When I was developing as a fetus, my head was growing, my scalp was forming, getting bigger and bigger as my head grew, is that somewhere up here, 2 cells divided that were going to be scalp cells. And should be 46 chromosomes and 46 chromosomes. And then what happened? 47 chromosomes and 45. How do I know that? Well, I carry an allele for brown hair and an allele for red hair. And it's not exactly dominant recessive. The red often is expressed somewhat, but the brown is a dark color, and expressed together, it tends to cover the red up. You get red highlights and other sorts of things. But what happened was, so I had a chromosome with the brown on it and a chromosome with the red on it, and make copies. And those copies are supposed to, I can't do this with my fingers, the copies are supposed to separate out when you make new cells. But what happened was, 2 of the browns and 1 of the reds went where it's to 1, and it just left, okay, I'm about to give you the finger. Bad idea. That left the chromosome with the red on it all alone, no brown next to it. Now, if that happens early in development, having extra chromosomes, all those extra codes can really mess you up. You're not going to survive really long. But when the cells are pretty settled and they're not doing much, they're making scalp, then how many times are they dipping into that chromosome for genes where having a missing copy or an extra copy is gonna mess them up. Turns out it doesn't happen that often. But what I did wind up with was this cell kept making cells with only the one chromosome with the red allele on it. So I wound up with a patch back when I used to have hair that had color. Patch about that big around on the top of my head that was just bright red hair. Scared the hell out of barbers. Because they would be snipping away with scissors and then they'd hit this pool of red and be thinking, I didn't cut this kid, what's going on here? But that's called a mosaicism, where chromosomes don't divide properly. You get an extra one going one way and a missing one going the other way. And then if there was a significant difference in the two alleles on those chromosomes, then, and one of them was mostly hidden, it's not gonna be hidden now, the red hair showed up. Okay, I'm trying to keep these shorter, so I'm gonna stop this here.